Have you ever imagined a wild animal choosing to trust you? Not just for a day, not for a week, but for years? It was supposed to be a fleeting encounter, a simple act of kindness. But against all odds, it became something much greater. An unlikely bond between a family and a creature of the forest, a connection that defied nature and touched the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. What made that small animal return, day after day? What did it see in that house that made it feel safe? And most importantly, what was the defining moment that changed everything forever? This is the story of an unbreakable bond, and the day nature's trust found a home. The forest whispered under the crisp afternoon wind, its towering trees swaying as if sharing secrets among themselves. The sky, heavy with gray clouds, warned of an approaching storm. The scent of damp earth lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of wet leaves and old wood. Then, in the hush broken only by the rustling branches, a faint sound emerged. A soft, trembling chirp, barely audible. Lying on the ground, among broken twigs and scattered leaves, was a tiny creature. Its fur, a mix of brown and gray, was soaked by the light drizzle that had begun to fall. Its frail body trembled, half-closed eyes fighting against exhaustion. A baby squirrel. It could barely move. Its shallow, rapid breaths hinted that something was terribly wrong. Perhaps it had fallen from a high nest, carried by the wind. Or worse, perhaps it had been alone for far too long. Hesitation lasted only a second before gentle hands reached out. The touch was light, careful, as if the slightest movement might break it. The squirrel barely reacted. The wind howled louder, carrying distant thunder, a warning that the storm was closing in. There was no time to waste. The decision was made in an instant. They couldn't leave it there. With a racing heart and the fragile creature cradled in warm hands, the path home was hurried. Branches groaned above, and the sound of rain, now heavier, created a tense symphony all around. Each step echoed through the muddy trail, while the tiny squirrel, too weak to resist, simply breathed, slow and faint. The door creaked open, and the warmth of the house wrapped around the small, frozen body. Soft lights filled the cozy space, the scent of burning wood from the fireplace blending with the sweet aroma of hot tea. A soft towel was quickly fetched, wrapping the squirrel gently. It needed warmth, it needed food, it needed a second chance. But no one knew that this seemingly simple moment would change everything. What appeared to be just a rescue was, in fact, the beginning of something much greater. Something no one could have predicted. Rain drummed against the wooden house's windows, its droplets trailing down the glass like tiny silver rivers. Outside, the storm grew stronger, distant thunder rolling through the sky, making the room's lamps flicker slightly. At the center of the living room, the family gathered around their unexpected guest. The baby squirrel, still fragile, was nestled in a soft towel, its damp fur beginning to dry under the gentle warmth of the crackling fireplace. The youngest daughter, her eyes wide with worry, hesitantly extended a finger and lightly touched the tiny creature's head. It moved just a little, a weak sign of life, but a response nonetheless. "He's so cold," the girl murmured, her voice almost swallowed by the snapping flames. The father, a man of few words, stood with his arms crossed, watching carefully. He had seen wild animals before. He knew not all of them survived outside their natural habitat. But there was something different about this little squirrel. The mother, with the tenderness of someone who had cared for many lives, prepared a makeshift bottle. She grabbed a dropper, filling it with a warm mixture of milk and honey, knowing the tiny creature needed strength. The girl held her breath as her mother carefully placed the dropper against the squirrel's tiny lips. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence in the room deepened, and even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. Then, a subtle movement. The baby's lips parted weakly, and a single drop of liquid disappeared into its mouth. The girl's heart raced. "He's drinking." The father leaned in slightly, and even the mother, always cautious, allowed a small smile to appear. It was a sign of hope. Small, but real. The night stretched on. Outside, the wind howled, bending the trees into shadowy figures against the blackened sky. Inside, the squirrel finally slept, curled up in a piece of soft fabric. Its breathing, once unsteady, now seemed more rhythmic. But even with this small progress, uncertainty still lingered in the air. They had saved its life for now, but what came next? Would it survive? And if it did, what would happen then? The storm roared beyond the walls, but no one knew that the biggest change was still ahead. The little squirrel wasn't just a temporary guest. It was about to become part of their family in a way no one could have imagined. Dawn brought fresh, damp air into the house as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the thin mist still hovering over the forest. The scent of wet earth mingled with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee, creating a peaceful atmosphere. The girl was the first to wake. She jumped out of bed, not even bothering to put on her slippers, and rushed into the living room. There he was. The tiny squirrel still slept, curled up in the soft towel that had now become his makeshift nest. His small chest rose and fell steadily, no longer struggling for breath like the night before. "He looks better, doesn't he?" The girl's voice broke the quiet morning, and her mother, preparing another makeshift bottle, smiled gently. "Yes. He's getting stronger." Her father, seated at the kitchen table, glanced up from his newspaper and observed the little creature for a moment. He still wasn't convinced this was a good idea. Wild animals belonged in the forest, and any bond with humans would only make his return to his true home more difficult. But he said nothing. The girl sat on the floor beside the basket where the squirrel rested, stretching out her hand, not to touch him, but just to be close. Time passed, and the next few days became a slow process of trust building. The squirrel began to respond more to their presence. At first, just lifting his head when he heard the girl's voice. Then, taking the milk from the dropper without hesitation. His recovery was clear, his once trembling paws now had strength, and his eyes, once dull with exhaustion, now shone, alert and curious. But on the 5th day, something changed. The squirrel, who had so far remained mostly still, focusing on regaining his strength, finally moved on his own. With a timid effort, he climbed up the girl's sleeve. She froze, feeling the tiny claws grasping the fabric delicately. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with a mixture of surprise and joy. From across the room, her father, arms crossed, let out a short sigh. "Looks like he's chosen you." The girl grinned. From that moment on, everything changed. The tiny guest, once a fragile and frightened creature, now seemed to have fully embraced his new reality. He no longer just accepted the family's care, he sought it out. He spent his mornings perched on the girl's shoulder, following her around the house, curling into the folds of her coat whenever he felt cold. In the afternoons, he sat on the porch, watching the backyard with an almost knowing gaze, as if deep down, he understood this wasn't truly his home. And every evening, as the family gathered for dinner, he remained close. No longer just a visitor, but part of the home. The father, though still reluctant, was beginning to accept what was already obvious to everyone. This little squirrel wasn't just a wild animal in need of help. He was something much more than that. And deep down, perhaps the family needed him just as much as he had needed them. The afternoon breeze drifted gently across the porch, carrying the scent of damp earth and freshly fallen leaves. The sky was painted in shades of gold and amber, casting a warm and welcoming glow over the landscape. The little squirrel, now stronger and more agile, rested in the girl's lap, nibbling on a nut with deep concentration. The family watched in silence. In recent days, a question had lingered in the air like an unavoidable shadow: when would it be time to let him go? The squirrel was no longer the fragile creature he once was. His paws were steady, his fur sleek, and his eyes sharp, tracking every movement around him. He explored the house with curiosity but always returned, as if the safety of those familiar arms still felt more comforting than the vastness of the forest ahead. From a distance, the father closed the book he had been reading and slowly approached. The mother, leaning against the doorframe, crossed her arms. They knew the girl was struggling against the inevitable. It was easy to grow attached to the little animal, but it was impossible to ignore that he belonged somewhere else. The next day, the decision was made. The porch door was left open, and for the first time, there was nothing separating him from the world outside. The squirrel remained still for a moment, his tiny ears twitching as he felt the crisp wind against his fur. He sniffed the air, took a few cautious steps across the wooden floor, and then leaped onto the soft earth. The girl watched, her heart pounding. He explored the yard hesitantly, sniffing the ground and darting toward the base of the large tree. He climbed the trunk, stretching his slender body with newfound agility. For a brief moment, it seemed like he would continue forward. But then, in an instant, he turned and ran back to her, scrambling up her leg and perching on her shoulder. The family exchanged knowing smiles. He wasn't ready yet. The following days became a cycle of attempts and returns. Each morning, the girl released him into the yard, and each time, he ventured a little further. He dashed through the grass, climbed higher branches, and learned to leap from tree to tree. But he always came back, as if an invisible thread still tied him to the home that had saved him. Until, on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, the choice was finally his. The girl placed him on the ground, just as she had every morning. The squirrel hesitated, his dark eyes locking onto hers for a brief moment, as if taking it all in. And then, he ran. But this time, he didn't return. The girl jumped to her feet, scanning the treetops frantically. Her heart pounded as she searched for one last glimpse of his tiny shadow darting through the branches. But he was already gone. Behind her, her parents watched in silence. There was nothing left to do. He had finally found his way home. That night, the house felt a little emptier. The quiet in the girl's room was different, and the absence of their small guest was felt in every corner. But she wasn't sad. Because deep inside, something told her that this story wasn't over yet. She didn't know when, or how. But he would come back. Of that, she was certain. Are you enjoying the story? You don't believe what will happen. Keep following this incredible journey, but remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel to hear more exciting stories, like this one. The days passed slowly. The girl, still accustomed to the presence of the little squirrel, looked out the window every morning, hoping to catch a familiar glimpse among the fallen leaves in the yard. But nothing happened. Time moved forward, bringing with it the changing of the seasons. Autumn covered the ground in golden leaves, and the cold wind announced the arrival of winter. The house, once filled with tiny scurrying sounds and quick movements, now felt quieter. Even knowing she had done the right thing, the girl couldn't help but miss him. Then, on an ordinary morning, something different happened. The day dawned gray, with a fine rain streaming down the windows. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the scent of burning wood from the fireplace. Her father read the newspaper, her mother prepared breakfast, and the girl sat by the window, watching the raindrops dance on the glass as the tree branches swayed gently in the wind. That's when she saw it. A subtle movement caught her attention. Perched on the windowsill, huddled against the damp wood, was a small figure. Her heart pounded. She jumped to her feet, hardly believing her eyes. He was back. The squirrel, now larger and sturdier, had fur dampened by the rain and eyes that shimmered with a mix of familiarity and need. He didn't move, just waited, as if he knew he would be noticed. Without hesitation, the girl opened the window. A gust of cold wind rushed into the house, sending shivers up her arms, but she didn't care. She slowly extended her hand, unsure if he would accept her touch. Then, to her astonishment, he leapt straight onto her shoulder. A wave of emotion crashed over her. The moment felt unreal. The squirrel sniffed her hair, as if confirming she was truly the one he remembered. Her parents, watching in silent surprise, exchanged a glance. But as the girl looked more closely, she noticed something. He was injured. His front paw had a small cut, and he limped slightly as he moved. It was then that she understood why he had come back. He hadn't returned just because he missed her. He needed help. The instinct to care for him reignited within her. Without hesitation, she cradled him gently in her hands and brought him closer to the fireplace, where the warmth could soothe him. Her mother fetched a dry cloth, and her father retrieved the small box they had once used to care for him. The scene felt like it was repeating itself, yet something was different. This time, he knew he was safe. The girl stroked his tiny head gently, feeling his rapid heartbeat beneath her fingers. The squirrel closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to relax. He trusted them. He trusted her. And just like that, as if he had never left, he was part of the home once again. But the greatest secret was yet to come. The storm outside roared against the windows, thunder rolling through the night like distant drums. Inside the cozy warmth of the house, the squirrel rested in a makeshift nest of soft fabrics, his half-closed eyes breathing slowly as he received the care of the family. The girl watched him with tenderness, feeling an immense joy at having him back. But at the same time, something felt different. A quiet unease, a sense that this unexpected visit still carried a hidden truth. That night, as the silence of the house blended with the sound of the rain, a faint noise caught her attention. Soft, almost imperceptible, coming from the small box where the squirrel lay. She held her breath and moved closer. And then, she saw it. There, nestled in a corner of the makeshift nest, 3 tiny baby squirrels wriggled slightly, their fragile bodies trembling under the warmth of the fabric. Her heart pounded. She stepped back, unable to believe what she was seeing. The squirrel hadn't just returned out of need or survival instinct. He had brought something precious. He had entrusted her with his greatest treasure. Her parents, awakened by their daughter's hushed gasp, approached and looked inside the box. Shock and amazement flashed in their eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. The girl looked at the squirrel, now gazing back at them, his dark eyes glistening under the soft glow of the lamp. As if he knew exactly what he had done. As if he understood that this was the one place where his babies would be safe. A shiver ran down the girl's spine. This wasn't just a wild animal returning to the ones who had once helped him. This was a mother bringing her family to a place she considered home. Time seemed to slow. The girl extended her hand, gently running her fingers over the squirrel's fur, feeling the depth of the connection between them. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stayed there, as if silently telling her that this was the only place he trusted to leave his newborns. The weight of that trust made the girl's eyes burn with emotion. They had a choice to make. And deep down, she already knew what it would be. That night, with the wind whispering outside and the warmth of the fireplace wrapping around them, a silent promise was made. They wouldn't just care for the wounded squirrel. They would welcome his new family, too. And nothing would ever be the same again. Dawn cast a golden glow through the curtains, spreading soft shadows across the wooden floor. The storm's winds had calmed, leaving behind a serene stillness that wrapped around the house like a quiet promise. But inside, life pulsed in a different way. The family gathered around the makeshift nest, watching the little squirrel rest with her 3 tiny babies. They were so small, so fragile, their delicate bodies covered in the finest, softest fur. The girl could hardly look away. She had never imagined she would one day be responsible for something so precious. The house was already awake, but no one spoke. They all knew what was coming. The girl held a small bowl of fruit in her hands, stepping carefully toward the shelter where the baby squirrels clumsily tumbled over one another, full of energy and curiosity. They were strong now, eager, ready to explore the world beyond the walls that had kept them safe. But something was different that morning. The babies shifted, their tiny bodies seeking warmth. And their mother, though once injured, remained watchful, ever vigilant, making sure everything was just as it should be. The home, once just a refuge for people, had become a sanctuary for something greater. Something that went beyond species, beyond instinct, beyond fear. The father and mother exchanged glances, understanding each other without the need for words. The decision they had made the night before now seemed clearer than ever. They would provide a safe place for these little ones. They would care for them until they were ready to face the world. The days that followed were filled with a new rhythm. The girl devoted herself to the babies with a patience she hadn't known she possessed. She carefully followed every bit of research she could find on feeding and care, doing everything she could to help the mother squirrel. The father, with his skilled hands, built a larger, sturdier shelter near the porch, a safe space where the little ones could grow strong. The mother prepared fresh portions of fruit and seeds, ensuring that their new residence never went without. Time passed, and the babies grew. Their eyes opened to the world, their tiny legs steadied, and soon they were venturing beyond their shelter, exploring with newfound confidence. The girl watched their progress with a mix of pride and a quiet ache in her chest. She knew the day would come. They would have to leave. And the mother squirrel seemed to know it, too. One morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon and mist still clung to the grass, something changed. The mother squirrel, who had spent weeks nestled with her young, stepped outside their shelter for the first time. Her keen eyes scanned the surroundings, and then she leaped onto the fence, lifting her head toward the towering trees. She was calling them. The babies hesitated. It was as if they could feel the shift, the instinctive pull toward the unknown world waiting for them. The girl knelt beside the shelter, her heart pounding. She reached out her hand, and one of the tiny squirrels paused, looking into her eyes before taking a few hesitant steps forward, pressing its tiny paw against her palm. It was brief, but it meant everything. That small touch held the weight of all they had shared. It was a thank you. She smiled, eyes misting with emotion. One by one, the babies finally began to follow their mother. First one, then another, until all three were lined up behind her, moving carefully toward the fence, climbing with delicate, eager claws. The family watched in silence. The father rested a hand on his daughter's shoulder, a quiet gesture of comfort. The mother, standing beside them, laced her fingers together, holding back the urge to call them back. But this wasn't goodbye. It was a beginning. The mother squirrel turned back one last time before making the leap into the old oak tree. The babies hesitated, glancing back at the family as if memorizing the faces that had cared for them all this time. And then, one by one, they followed her. The branches swayed, the leaves rustled, and in a single breath, they disappeared into the canopy above. The yard fell silent. A single tear rolled down the girl's cheek, but it wasn't sadness. It was the certainty that they had done the right thing. The bonds they had formed would never fade. Would they come back? She didn't know. But every time the wind whispered through the branches of that tree, she liked to believe that, in some way, they were still there. And maybe, just maybe, one day, a little squirrel with curious eyes would return to her window. Just to remind her that some stories never really end. Some stories don't need words to be told. They live in small gestures, in silent glances, in the fleeting moments that shape our understanding of the world. What began as a simple act of compassion became an unbreakable bond between a family and a tiny visitor from the forest. Over days, weeks, and months, trust was built, brick by brick, not through ownership, but through respect. And when the time came, their farewell wasn't a final goodbye. It was proof that true love doesn't cage, it teaches how to fly, to run, to climb one's own story. The mother squirrel and her babies were gone, but they left behind something that could never fade, the reminder that when we treat nature with kindness, it always finds a way to give back. And maybe, on some quiet morning, as the golden sunlight filters through the leaves and the wind whispers through the trees, a squirrel will appear at the window once again. Not asking for help, but simply to remind them that he never forgot. If you've followed the story this far, give it a like, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this.